The lawyer cleared his throat only once before beginning. That alone told me something was wrong. The room was too quiet for a family that had spent the last decade arguing over silverware, land deeds, and who deserved what after my death. Now they sat stiffly in their chairs, eyes sharp, lips pressed thin, waiting to be rewarded for patience they had never truly shown me. I folded my hands in my lap and watched them without blinking. They had no idea what was coming. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 78 years old. For 46 years, I built a life, a fortune, and a family that learned to smile at me while measuring the value of my furniture behind my back. And today, I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "are you certain you want me to proceed?" I nodded. Across the table, my eldest son, Richard, leaned back with forced confidence. He crossed his arms like a man who already owned the room. His wife, Deborah, clutched her designer purse, her foot bouncing slightly under the table. My grandchildren sat scattered like chess pieces, some bored, some nervous, all hungry. Greedy people have a smell to them. You learn it when you've lived long enough. The lawyer began reading. "I, Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, being of sound mind." Richard smirked, Deborah exhaled. They thought this was the victory lap. They had no idea this sentence would freeze the blood in their veins. But before that moment, you need to understand how we arrived here. You need to know what they did when they thought I wasn't listening, when they believed time itself was on their side. It started the winter I stopped driving, not because I couldn't, but because I wanted to see who would come without being asked. No one did. My house, once loud with holidays and excuses, became quiet, calls slowed, visits became check-ins, the kind where people glance at your medication bottles and calculate how much longer they'll have to pretend. Richard suggested selling the lake house to simplify things. Deborah recommended downsizing my furniture. My youngest daughter, Marlene, asked me too casually where I kept important papers. I answered sweetly every time. Inside, I wrote everything down. The first real crack came at my 76th birthday dinner. They were all there, dressed well, smiling too hard. I watched them pass dishes without asking me what I wanted, talk over me, finish my sentences like I was already fading. Then my grandson Caleb raised his glass. "To Grandma," he said, "may she finally get some rest soon." Laughter followed, nervous, polite. I smiled. Caleb leaned closer and whispered, "You know what I mean." Oh, I knew. That night, I changed my will. Not the way they expected. I didn't remove names, I added conditions. And I hired a lawyer who didn't talk too much. Over the next year, I watched them unravel themselves. Richard tried to access accounts he didn't realize were locked behind permissions he no longer had. Deborah pushed harder, suggesting assisted living, then full-time care. Marlene cried once, dramatically, about how hard it was watching me age. I asked her when she had last watched me at all. She didn't answer. What none of them knew was that I had already given away the things that mattered. The charities, the scholarships, the trust for children they had never noticed, the gardener's daughter, the nurse's son, the librarian who read to me after my eyesight worsened. I left the house exactly as it was. I wanted them to fight over it, and they would. The day of the reading arrived colder than expected. They came early, too early. Richard took the chair closest to the lawyer. Deborah adjusted the curtains like she already owned them. Caleb scrolled on his phone, smirking. Marlene dabbed at imaginary tears. I sat quietly at the end of the table. The lawyer began. "I leave my jewelry too." They leaned forward. The auction house. Confusion flickered. My vehicles sold. Murmurs. The lake house transferred. Richard's smile tightened. "To whom?" he snapped. The lawyer didn't look up. As stated. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Deborah whispered something sharp under her breath. Then came the line. The sentence. The one that made the lawyer pause, just long enough for everyone to notice. He read it slowly. "I leave my heirs exactly what they have given me over the years." Silence. Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" The lawyer swallowed. "One sentence," he continued, voice steady now. "No revisions." And then he read what followed. Caleb's phone slipped from his hand. Deborah's face drained of color. Richard stood up so fast his chair fell backward. "No," he said, "that's not, this isn't." I finally spoke. "It is." They turned to me like they were seeing a ghost. I smiled, not kindly. "You wanted everything," I said softly. I listened. The lawyer stopped reading. The room felt colder than winter. And that was only the beginning. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because they were polite, but because their minds were racing, trying to catch up to something they never imagined losing control of. Richard recovered first. He always did. He had spent his entire life practicing how to regain footing when the ground shifted beneath him. "This is some kind of joke," he said, forcing a laugh that cracked halfway through. "Mom, come on, you scared us for a second." I didn't answer. The lawyer adjusted his papers, though there was nothing left to adjust. His hands were steady, but his eyes had hardened. He had seen anger before. He had never seen entitlement collapse this fast. "Mrs. Whitmore," Deborah said, her voice syrupy now, the way it got when she wanted something. "We should talk privately." "No," I replied. That single word landed heavier than any argument. Marlene finally looked at me, not at the table, not at the carpet, not at the imaginary tears she kept wiping away, but at my face. Her eyes searched for softness. She didn't find it. "Mom," she said quietly, "what did we do?" I laughed once, a short sound, sharp. "You want the list in order," I said, "or do you want to hear it the way I lived it?" The lawyer cleared his throat again. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps." "I'm fine," I said. "Read the rest." Richard slammed his palm on the table. "There is no rest. You can't just." "Sit down," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He hesitated. That was new. The lawyer continued. "For clarity," he read, "each heir shall receive one symbolic item, reflecting the relationship maintained with the testator during her lifetime." Deborah's nails dug into her purse. Caleb leaned forward now, his arrogance replaced with suspicion. "What kind of items?" The lawyer looked at me. I nodded. He began with Richard. "To my son, Richard Whitmore, I leave the office chair from my study." Richard blinked. "What?" "The chair," the lawyer repeated. "Specifically, the one facing away from the window." I spoke before Richard could explode. "You liked sitting with your back to the view." I said, "You never stayed long enough to notice it." His jaw tightened. "To Deborah Whitmore," the lawyer continued, "I leave the guest room mirror." Deborah's voice trembled. "Why would I want a mirror?" "So you can continue practicing concern." I said, "You were very good at it." Marlene's turn came next. "To my daughter, Marlene, I leave the answering machine." Her face flushed. "That's cruel." "No," I said calmly, "that's accurate. You only spoke to me when it was convenient. Now you can hear yourself." Caleb was last. "To my grandson, Caleb, I leave the birthday card he never finished writing." The room erupted. "This is insane," Richard shouted. "This won't hold up. We'll contest everything." "You can try," the lawyer said quietly, "but I advise against it." Deborah spun toward him. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that every decision was documented." "Witnessed and reviewed," he replied. "Extensively." Their faces shifted again. This time fear crept in. Richard turned back to me. "You planned this." I tilted my head. "You gave me plenty of time." Marlene's voice broke. "You're punishing us." "No," I said. "I'm returning the effort." The lawyer began packing his briefcase. "Meeting adjourned," he said. "Any further communication should go through my office." They stood there, stunned, as he left. None of them followed him. They followed me instead. I could feel it, their footsteps trailing, their anger simmering, their certainty cracking. For the first time, they were reacting instead of directing. Richard cornered me in the hallway. "You think this makes you powerful." He hissed, "You think you've won." I looked at him, really looked at him. The lines around his mouth were deeper now, his hair thinner. He had spent years waiting for something that had already slipped past him. "This wasn't about winning," I said. "It was about truth." He scoffed, "You're alone now." I smiled. "Am I?" That night, my phone rang 12 times. I didn't answer. The next morning, the calls came from numbers I didn't recognize. Attorneys, financial advisors, people who had never returned my calls when I asked simple questions years ago. Now they wanted meetings. I declined. Instead, I made tea and watched the snow melt off the hedges. By noon, Marlene showed up at my door. She looked smaller without her practiced composure. No makeup, no speech prepared. "I didn't know you felt like this," she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She wandered the living room like a stranger. "I tried," she said. "I really did." I handed her a cup of tea. Trying requires presence. She swallowed. "Is there anything we can do?" I sat across from her. "You already did it," I said. "You chose." Tears fell then, real ones. They didn't move me. After she left, I went upstairs and opened the study. The chair Richard was inheriting sat exactly where it always had, facing the wall. I moved it to the window. Outside, the world was bright and quiet. That evening, the lawyer called. "They're panicking," he said. "I assumed," I replied. They want to negotiate. I'm not selling anything. There was a pause. They've discovered the trusts. I smiled into the receiver. Which ones? All of them. Richard had assumed he was clever. He had assumed money moved loudly. He had never noticed how quietly it could disappear when guided with intention. Over the next week, things unraveled fast. The lake house became a community center. My jewelry funded scholarships. My accounts, once the object of whispered conversations, were no longer theirs to calculate. Caleb posted something bitter online. It vanished hours later. Deborah stopped calling. Richard sent one final message. You didn't have to destroy us. I typed back. You weren't destroyed, you were revealed. I blocked the number. For the first time in years, my house felt light. No footsteps measuring its worth. No eyes scanning corners. Just silence. And peace. But the story didn't end there. Because greed doesn't disappear, it changes shape. And they weren't finished trying to take what they believed was theirs. Not yet. They didn't come at me directly after that. That would have required humility. And none of them had ever learned how to bend without believing they were breaking. Instead, they went after the air around me. It started subtly. A reporter called, claiming to be doing a human interest piece on elderly estate disputes. Then another, then a third, less polite than the others, who asked whether I was mentally competent at the time of drafting the will. I laughed and hung up. By the end of the week, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly waving too hard, asking questions that sounded rehearsed. The grocery clerk asked if I was holding up okay. My church received an anonymous letter expressing concern for my well-being. Richard had always understood one thing well. If you couldn't take control of the money, you took control of the narrative. What he didn't understand was that I had already anticipated that, too. The lawyer, Thomas Green, came by on a Wednesday afternoon. Unannounced but expected, he never knocked more than once. He trusted the weight of his presence to announce itself. They've filed a petition, he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. Not to contest the will outright, not yet. What are they claiming? I asked. Undue influence, he replied, and cognitive decline. I stirred my tea slowly. Of course. They're asking for an evaluation. I've had 3 in the last 2 years, I said. All clean. I know, they're hoping for a different doctor. I looked up at him. Will it work? He shook his head. No, but that's not the point. The point was pressure. I had lived long enough to recognize the rhythm of a siege. You should consider staying somewhere else for a while. Thomas said, just until this settles. No, I replied, this is my house. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. All right, then we prepare. Prepare meant paperwork, affidavits, timelines. It meant printing emails they had forgotten to delete, voicemails they assumed I never listened to, messages sent to each other about me, about how long I had left, about what they would do once it was over. The most damaging one came from Deborah. We just need to keep her calm until she's gone. I slept well that night. The first official letter arrived 2 days later. Formal, cold, signed by an attorney I recognized, expensive, aggressive, and very fond of public courtrooms. Richard wasn't playing small. I called Thomas. It's time, I said. For what? For the second sentence. There was a pause, then a breath. Are you sure? Yes. The following Monday, Thomas filed a motion of his own. Not defensive. Offensive. He requested the court unseal the accompanying documentation attached to my will, documents I had chosen not to reveal during the initial reading. Within 24 hours, Richard's attorney called to request a meeting. Thomas declined. Within 48 hours, the story changed. The headline wasn't kind. Local businessman accused of financial manipulation in family estate dispute. Richard's name appeared below it. Then Deborah's. Then Caleb's, tied to a smaller piece. Buried deep in the article, but enough to make his employer nervous. By evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was Richard. I let it ring until the machine picked up. Mom, his voice said, tight and unfamiliar. We need to talk. I erased it without listening to the rest. The next morning, Marlene showed up again. She looked worse this time, pale, hollow, as if she hadn't slept. They're blaming you, she said the moment I opened the door. I know, I replied. They're saying you planned all of this just to humiliate them. I stepped aside and let her in. She stood in the center of the living room, like someone waiting to be told where to sit. Did you? She asked. I met her eyes. I planned to be honest. She swallowed. Richard says you're enjoying this. I smiled faintly. Richard doesn't understand joy. She sat down heavily. He's scared. Good, I said. Her head snapped up. How can you say that? Because fear is the only thing that ever made him listen. She stood abruptly. You're tearing this family apart. I didn't raise my voice. This family tore itself apart slowly. I said, I'm just refusing to hold it together anymore. She stared at me like she wanted to argue, then realized she had nothing left to say. When she left, she didn't hug me. That afternoon, the court ordered the release of the documents. The voicemails went public first, then the emails, then the trust structures, legal, ethical, devastating. Richard's board requested an emergency meeting. Deborah's social circle went quiet. Caleb deleted his accounts. And still, they didn't stop. They escalated. The petition shifted from cognitive decline to elder abuse. The implication was clear. Someone had manipulated me. Someone like Thomas. Or worse, someone unnamed. The court scheduled a hearing. I insisted on attending. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, neutral colors. No jewelry, hair neat, face calm. Power doesn't shout in court. It waits. Richard avoided my eyes when we entered. Deborah didn't. Her stare was sharp, desperate. The judge listened patiently as their attorney spoke of concern, of protection, of confusion. Then Thomas stood. He didn't raise his voice either. He introduced Exhibit A, then B, then C, each one a nail, each one hammered with precision. When he played Deborah's voicemail aloud, the courtroom shifted. When he read Richard's message, once she's gone, it's finally ours, someone in the back gasped. The judge leaned forward. Richard's attorney asked for a recess. Denied. When it was over, the ruling was brief. The petition was dismissed. Sanctions were imposed. And the court issued a warning. Abuse works both ways. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Richard spoke first. He shouldn't have. He said my name. He said the word betrayal. He said mother. I stepped forward then. Just once. I gave them exactly what they wanted, I said calmly. The truth. I turned and walked away. That night, I sat in my study. The chair still faced the window. My phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. They're finished. I looked around the room. The books, the light, the quiet. No, I typed back. They're empty. Outside, the street was calm. Inside, for the first time in years, so was I. But somewhere, far from my house, Richard Whitmore was realizing something terrifying. He hadn't just lost the inheritance. He had lost control of the ending. And people like Richard never accept that quietly. Not ever. Richard didn't disappear after the hearing. That would have required reflection. Instead, he went quiet. And silence, when it comes from men like him, is never peace, it's calculation. 3 days passed, then 4, no calls. No messages, no leaks to the press. The kind of calm that feels staged. On the 5th day, Thomas called me early. They've changed strategy, he said. I was already awake. Of course they have. They've hired a private firm. He continued, not legal, investigative. I closed my eyes for a moment. To do what? To find something that doesn't exist. He replied, or make something look like it does. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. Let them. You're not concerned. I've lived cleanly, I said. That's the luxury of time. There was a pause. They're trying to get to you through perception now. They already tried that. Yes, Thomas said, but this time they're being personal. That afternoon, a woman knocked on my door. She introduced herself as a wellness consultant. Smiled too easily. Her eyes moved too much. I work with families during difficult transitions. She said, your son expressed concern. I didn't invite her in. I'm not interested, I replied. She hesitated. It would just be a conversation. I've had enough of those, I said, and closed the door. The next day, 2 men appeared across the street. One pretended to check his phone. The other pretended not to be watching my house. I waved. They left within minutes. Richard was circling now, trying to remind me that power could still be exercised. If not through money, then through presence. He underestimated how little that scared me. On Thursday evening, Deborah sent a letter. Not an email, not a message. A letter. It was handwritten, carefully, as if effort itself could be proof of sincerity. She apologized, not for what she'd done, but for how things had been misunderstood. She spoke of family, of legacy, of reconciliation. At the bottom, she wrote, we don't want this to end badly. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the others. That night, someone tried to access my accounts again. This time, alarms triggered. Thomas called within minutes. They're desperate. Good, I said again. But desperation sharpens people. It makes them reckless. The next move came from Caleb. A video surfaced online, grainy. Clipped, edited just enough to suggest confusion. It showed me at a grocery store weeks earlier, pausing at the register, asking the cashier to repeat the total. The caption read, "Is this who should control millions?" The comments were quick, cruel, certain. I watched it once, then I turned off my phone. The following morning, Thomas arrived with coffee and a look I recognized. "They're pushing for emergency guardianship." He said, "Temporary, they're citing public concern." "Will it work?" I asked. "No," he replied, "but it will be loud." "Then it's time," I said. "For what?" he asked, though I could tell he already knew. "For the third sentence." He nodded slowly. "Once this is out, there's no walking back." "I've never walked backward," I said. That afternoon, Thomas filed a release. Not to the court. To the public. It was a recording. My voice clear, calm, dated weeks before the grocery store video. In it, I spoke about aging, about moments of pause, about how confusion is not weakness, but manipulation is. Then came the documentation. The edited video, the raw footage, the timestamps. Caleb's name appeared again. The backlash was immediate. The comments flipped. The sympathy evaporated. By evening, the guardianship request was withdrawn. Richard sent one final message. "You've gone too far." I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed, "So did you." I blocked him again. That night, I dreamed of my house filled with light. No voices, no tension, just space. In the morning, the final move arrived. A lawsuit. Not about the will. About defamation. Richard was suing me, claiming I had ruined his reputation intentionally. Thomas read it once and smiled without humor. "He's burning everything," he said, "including himself." "Let him," I replied. The court date was set quickly. This time, the room was fuller. The press returned. Richard looked thinner, older, like a man who had been awake too long chasing something that wouldn't slow down for him. When he testified, his voice shook. He spoke of betrayal, of cruelty, of a mother who had turned against her own blood. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. "I didn't ruin my son," I said. "I stopped protecting him from himself." The judge listened, then asked one question. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you act with malice?" I thought of every unanswered call, every calculation, every whispered plan. "No," I said, "I acted with clarity." The ruling came swiftly. Case dismissed. Costs assigned. Richard didn't look at me as we left. Outside, the cameras waited again. This time, I didn't stop. At home, I made tea. The house was quiet, but not empty, because somewhere deep inside, Richard Whitmore finally understood something he had avoided his entire life. Some inheritances aren't money. Some are lessons, and the ones learned too late cost the most. After the lawsuit collapsed, something shifted. Not outside. Inside them. People like Richard don't mourn losses the way others do. They inventory them. They replay moments, searching for the exact second where control slipped through their fingers. And when they can't find it, they invent a new story, one where they were robbed, ambushed, betrayed. That story became his refuge. Weeks passed without incident. No calls, no letters, no shadows across the street. The press moved on. Another scandal replaced mine. That's how attention works. It devours, then forgets. I didn't forget. I never do. Thomas came by one afternoon with a thinner folder than usual. "This is the last of it," he said, placing it on the table. "Everything has settled. Legally, financially, publicly." "And personally?" I asked. He paused. "That depends on definitions." I smiled. "It usually does." He hesitated before standing. "You should know. Richard resigned from the board." I nodded once. Deborah's friends stopped calling. He added, "And Caleb's job offer was withdrawn." Silence filled the room, not the tense kind, the earned kind. After Thomas left, I sat alone for a long time. Not thinking, just listening to the house breathe. Wood settles differently when it knows it won't be sold. Walls relax. That evening, there was a knock. I didn't expect one. When I opened the door, Marlene stood there. She looked different again. Not broken, not angry, just unguarded. "I won't stay long," she said. "You never do," I replied gently. She almost smiled. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Thomas and I had planned so many quiet counterstrikes. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said quickly. "I know better now." I studied her face. She had always been the softest of them, which is why they leaned on her the hardest. "Why are you here?" I asked. She swallowed. "Because I finally understand what you meant." I waited. "When you said we already chose." She continued. "I didn't believe you. I thought choices could be undone. And now, I asked. Now I see that some of them just finish, she said. We sat in silence. I don't expect forgiveness, she added. I just didn't want the story to end without truth. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. The story didn't end, I said. It changed authors. She squeezed my hand once, then stood. At the door, she turned back. Richard won't come, she said quietly. I know, I replied. When she left, I locked the door and didn't feel the need to unlock it again. Months later, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single newspaper clipping. Former executive declines interview amid ongoing personal matters. Richard's name was mentioned once. Buried, misspelled. I placed the clipping in the same drawer as Deborah's letter. Not out of spite. Out of closure. On a crisp autumn morning, I went to the study and sat in the chair, still facing the window. The trees outside had changed color. Slowly, honestly, no rush, no performance. I thought about the sentence that started everything. I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they wanted. They wanted certainty. They wanted ownership. They wanted the end to belong to them. Instead, they got something far more permanent. They got remembered for who they were when they thought no one was watching. As for me, I kept the only thing that ever truly mattered. My voice, my clarity, my ending. And if there's one thing I've learned after all these years, it's this. The most powerful inheritance isn't money. It's the moment when someone realizes, too late, that they should have loved you while they still had the chance. Time did what it always does. It kept moving, without asking permission, without waiting for apologies. Winter passed gently that year. No emergencies, no lawyers, no sudden knocks at the door. Just quiet mornings and long afternoons, where the sun stayed a little longer in the rooms that had once felt tense. I learned something then. Peace isn't loud when it arrives. It doesn't announce itself. It simply sits beside you, patiently, until you notice you're no longer bracing for impact. In early spring, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Mrs. Whitmore, a young man asked. Nervous, respectful, my name is Daniel. I work with the community center at the old lake house. Yes, I said. I just wanted to say thank you. He continued, because of your donation. We're opening a literacy program next month for kids who don't usually get chances like this. I closed my eyes. You're welcome, I said softly. After the call, I sat for a long time without moving. That was the moment it fully settled in, not the victory, not the revenge, not even the justice. The weight was gone. The inheritance had already reached the people who would carry it forward, quietly, without entitlement. A few weeks later, I ran into Deborah by accident. It was at a small bookstore downtown. I was browsing the history section when I felt someone freeze beside me. She looked smaller, not physically, emotionally, as if her certainty had evaporated and taken her posture with it. Eleanor, she said. I turned. Deborah, I replied politely. She hesitated. I didn't expect to see you. I live here, I said. An awkward pause followed. You look well, she said finally. So do you, I replied, though it wasn't entirely true. She swallowed. I wanted to say. You don't need to, I interrupted gently. Her eyes flickered. Relief, disappointment, maybe both. I hope you're happy, she said. I smiled, not sharply, not triumphantly. I am, I said. That was all. She left without another word. That summer, I hosted a small gathering in my backyard. Not family, friends, neighbors, people who had shown up without calendars, without expectations. The gardener's daughter brought her parents. The librarian brought a homemade pie. Laughter filled the space where tension once lived. Someone asked about my children. I didn't lie. I simply said, we chose different paths. And that was enough. Late that evening, after everyone had gone, I sat alone under the porch light and thought about Richard. Not with anger, with distance. I imagined him somewhere unfamiliar, forced to introduce himself without titles, without assumptions. Just a man explaining who he was without leaning on what he expected to inherit. I hoped, truly hoped, that someday he would understand. Not for my sake, for his own. In the fall, Thomas sent one last message. I'm retiring next month. I smiled at the screen. You earned it, I wrote back. So did you, he replied. On my 79th birthday, I woke up early and made coffee. I opened the drawer where I kept the letters, the clippings, the remnants of a chapter that no longer needed revisiting. I removed one item, the birthday card Caleb never finished. I read it one last time. Then I tore it in half and dropped it into the trash. Some things don't deserve to be archived. I spent the day quietly, no parties, no speeches, just a walk through the neighborhood and a long phone call with a friend who knew my favorite memories without asking. That night, I sat in the study. The chair was still by the window. I didn't move it. Outside, the lights of other houses flickered on one by one, lives unfolding, mistakes being made, chances other taken or wasted. I thought about the sentence that froze them. One sentence. That's all it took. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they wanted, an ending they could never control. And in doing so, I finally gave myself something they never noticed they were taking from me all along. Freedom, silence, and the dignity of choosing how my story would be remembered. I turned off the light, and for the first time in many years, I didn't look back. Thought the story had finally settled into its quiet ending. I was wrong. Closure is not a door that closes once. It's a path people either stop walking or keep returning to until they understand why it was never meant for them. The call came late in the evening, long after the neighborhood lights had gone out. A hospital. Richard. For a moment, I simply held the phone without speaking. The nurse's voice was careful, neutral, trained not to imply obligation. He listed you as next of kin. She said we weren't sure whether. I'll come, I replied. Not because I felt summoned, because I chose to go. The hospital smelled the way all hospitals do, clean enough to pretend nothing bad ever happens there. Richard was in a private room. He looked smaller than I remembered, not diminished by illness alone, but by something heavier. Failure has a way of changing posture. He opened his eyes when I entered. You came, he said, surprised. Yes, I replied, setting my coat aside. I wasn't busy. He smiled weakly, still sharp. I pulled a chair close to the bed, not the kind that leans forward, the kind that stays upright. We don't have much time, he said. You have some, I corrected. You always exaggerate when you're uncomfortable. He laughed once, then winced. They told me you took the chair in the study and turned it around, he said suddenly. I raised an eyebrow. You've been keeping track. Old habits, he murmured. Silence settled between us, not tense, not warm, honest. I wanted to say something, he said, before. I waited. I thought you'd break, he admitted. That you'd get scared, that you'd cave the way you always used to. I didn't interrupt. But you didn't, he continued. You just stopped. I nodded. Stopping isn't weakness, it's choice. He looked at the ceiling. I don't know how to live without leverage. That's because you never tried living without expectation, I said. He turned his head toward me then, really looked. Do you hate me? He asked. I considered the question carefully. No, I said. I outgrew that. His eyes filled, not dramatically, quietly, the way men cry when there's no one left to perform for. I thought inheritance meant security, he whispered. It does, I replied, when it's earned. He swallowed. I lost everything. No, I corrected gently. You lost what you thought belonged to you. There was a long pause. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I know, I replied. You never expected anything without terms. That almost made him smile. When I stood to leave, he reached for my hand, not desperately, not pleadingly, just enough to be noticed. You won, he said. I shook my head. This wasn't a competition, I replied. It was a boundary. I left before he could say anything else. Outside, the night air felt lighter than hospital air ever does. Weeks later, a notice arrived. Richard had passed quietly in his sleep. No headlines, no drama. Just a line. I didn't attend the service. Instead, I went to the lake house, now full of children's voices and borrowed laughter. I sat on a bench and watched a boy read aloud to a girl who corrected him gently. That was enough. Later that evening, I returned home and opened the drawer one last time. The letters, the clippings, the artifacts of a family that had mistaken proximity for connection. I removed them all, and I threw them away. Some stories don't need preserving. They need releasing. As I closed the drawer, I realized something final, something steady and irreversible. I had given them exactly what they wanted, and in doing so, I had taken back everything they never knew they were stealing. My time, my peace, my name. I turned off the light and went to bed. The house was silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt complete. After Richard's death, the world didn't pause. It never does. Cards arrived, polite ones, awkward ones. A few that tried too hard to say the right thing without knowing what that was. I read each once, then placed them neatly in a box I didn't plan to keep. Grief, when it comes late, doesn't behave the way people expect. There were no sudden waves, no collapsing moments. Just a quiet understanding that something unfinished had finally stopped asking to be completed. A month later, I received a call from a young woman named Hannah. Her voice was steady but careful, like someone holding something fragile without knowing its weight. She was a reporter, not the kind that hunts blood, the kind that asks permission. "I'm writing a piece about legacy," she said, "not money, impact. Your name keeps coming up." I considered saying no. Then I remembered how often my story had been told about me, never by me. "You can come," I said, "but I won't answer questions you already think you know the answers to." She agreed. We sat in the living room that afternoon. Sunlight touched the edges of the furniture. She didn't turn on a recorder right away. That told me everything I needed to know. "Why did you do it?" she asked eventually. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Because silence had been mistaken for permission," I replied. She nodded, writing slowly. "Do you regret anything?" she asked. I thought of Richard in the hospital, of Marlene at the table, of Caleb's unfinished card. "I regret the years I spent explaining myself to people who never planned to listen," I said. The article came out a week later. It didn't mention numbers. It didn't mention courtrooms. It talked about choice, boundaries, the quiet power of deciding when enough is enough. People recognized themselves in it. I could tell by the letters that followed. Not asking for advice, just saying thank you. That autumn, I updated my will one final time. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Everything was already where it belonged. I simply wrote a letter to be opened later. No instructions, no conditions. Just words. I placed it in the same drawer that was now empty. On my 80th birthday, I woke before sunrise and walked to the study. I stood by the window and watched the first light stretch across the street. I didn't sit in the chair. I didn't need to. Outside, a delivery truck stopped. Somewhere down the block, a child laughed. Life continued, unbothered by endings. I realized then that the sentence everyone remembered wasn't actually the most important one. Not the one that froze a room, but the one I never said out loud. That love is not proven by blood. That inheritance is not owed. That dignity is not something you ask for. It's something you claim. I closed the study door and left it open. Some rooms don't need guarding anymore. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I felt no urge to look backward. No curiosity about who might finally understand. No need for acknowledgement. Because the truth had already done its work. Quietly, completely. And when my story is told now, if it's told at all, it won't be about what I took away. It will be about what I refused to give. My peace, my voice, my ending. I turned off the light, and the house, faithful and calm, held the silence with me, exactly as it should.